Greetings, Chicago and the Major Taylor Trail Keepers greater communities. Thank you so much for joining in with me again this month. This month is February, which is the month that we historically have celebrated Black History Month. And I found it to be the perfect time to really let's take a deeper dive into letting our community and let Chicagoland really learn who is Major Taylor, really learn about who he is, other than we all know he was a bike rider. And the best way that I could think of to let our viewers get to really know Major Taylor in a very personal and intimate way is to invite my friend, none other than Michael Kranish. He is an investigative political reporter for the Washington Post. He's the co-author of several New York Times bestsellers, Trump Revealed. He's co-authored John F. Kerry, co-authored The Real Romney. He also authored Flight from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson at War, and he is the author of my favorite biography titled The World's Fastest Man, which is a biography of Major Taylor. So just briefly, 12 years before boxer Jack Johnson and 50 years before baseball player Jackie Robinson, Taylor faced racism at nearly every turn, especially by whites who feared he would disprove their stereotypes of blacks. In The World's Fastest Man, which took years for the writing by Michael Kranish, investigative journalist Michael Kranish reveals new information about Major Taylor based on a rare interview with his daughter and other never-before uncovered details from Taylor's life. Kranish shows how Taylor indeed became a world champion, traveled the world, was the toast of Paris, and was one of the most chronicled black men of his day. Kranish is also the recipient of the Society of Professional Journalists Award for Washington's correspondence in 2016. And so with that, Michael, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview and to talk to us about, in our community, about who Major Taylor is. And so, well, let's just get right into it. Unless there's anything about your intro that you'd like to add or change.
Well, I just want to thank you for having me, Brenda. I had the chance to be there when the book came out. Yes. I did a book talk that you were at Seminary Co-op. I went to the Major Taylor Trail, had a chance to see it. Yes. And, there's that wonderful mural on the trestle on the trail that has the quote that we all know that you quote about, in a word, I was a pioneer and therefore had to blaze my own trail. Yes. And that is a trail that, as you suggested, has been followed by so many great black athletes. He was the first, as I call him in a subtitle, Black American sports hero, because he did do this half a century before Jackie Robinson. Everyone, including myself, loves Jackie Robinson. And I think if Robinson was here today, that he would agree that Taylor's story should be told, that he did blaze that trail. So that's what I wanted to do. I mean, I got interested in this topic many, many years ago as a reporter with the Boston Globe when I did a magazine story. And in a sentence, it was, how did this man at the height of the Jim Crow era become such a celebrated athlete, defying all odds, expectations, and proving, racists wrong, saying that he could become world champion. And that trail, Chicago plays a very important part of this story. He lived there, he competed there. So I'm just delighted to be talking to you. And I want to thank you for what you do and the organization does to promote the Major Taylor Trail, promote Taylor's story. You've really got the first or one of the first major Taylor trails in the country. I can only think that in the future, there'll be many trails. People look back to you and your organization as the trailblazer in that regard. And there'll be many places that people talk about Major Taylor and the trail that celebrates his name.
Yes, and we spend an enormous amount of our time advocating to get the trail up to 2024 standards, because it was developed in the 1990s and it doesn't have any of the modern things that many of our current trails have today. So that's one of the things that we do advocate for. But we only have 25 minutes. I want to get down into Major Taylor. And so I want to start, can you just kind of set the context for us? Because I think one of the first things for people to understand who Major Taylor is, they have to understand what was the big deal about bikes at this time in this era. So, like, why were bikes such a big deal during Major Taylor's era? Can you paint that picture? Give us the setting.
If you will put yourself in the 1890s, there's really no automobiles. There's a handful in most cities, so it's really a non-entity. Horse and buggy, or horse was the way you got around. Yeah. Bicycles had been, up to a certain point, very unwieldy. There were the high wheelers, the things we see with gigantic front wheel and a tiny back wheel. Mm-hmm. Initially, they were not pneumatic or air-filled rubber tires, so it was very difficult to ride them. And then several things happened. There was this invention of the pneumatic tire, so that made a huge difference. And they also created what they called the safety bicycle. By its name, it was safer than those high-wheeled bicycles. So suddenly there was this boom of bicycle manufacturing all across the country, and millions of bicycles were made. And for a lot of people, this was the way out. So a lot of people at that time period, they lived close to home. Many people didn't leave within a few miles of where they lived. And suddenly it became this vehicle of freedom. And it was the way people got around. So there was this boom, and it became the most popular sport in the country, more popular than boxing, more popular than baseball. And the greatest cyclists became very, very wealthy. They became, to use a word from our day, superstars. Okay. And as you mentioned, Major Taylor became one of the most chronicled men of his day, black men of his day, because he was a incredible bicycle racer. And as we'll talk about, he defeated all of the white racers that he took on. So,
and before we get into this,
of all this made him, an incredible star.
Yes. So I want to get into the races, but I want you to now. Okay, so you've painted the time of the bike. This was the era of the bicycle. Ooh. Now, take us through his early childhood, and then at that point, I want us to really get into his cycling career. But can you walk us through? Tell us the story. Help us get to know him. The youthful Major Taylor before he became Major Taylor.
Major Taylor's parents had lived in Kentucky. His father, as I discovered in my research, fought in the Civil War. They moved to Indiana. By a stroke of good fortune, Taylor became friends with the son of a very wealthy man, and he became very good friends with this white kid of his own age who had a bicycle. He started riding a bicycle, started getting noticed for how good he was on the bicycle. He started performing stunts in front of a bicycle shop, wearing a military-style uniform. Maybe it was the uniform that his father wore in the Civil War. We don't know. But he soon got the nickname Major Taylor as a result of that, as a very young kid. And he started competing in races in Indiana. He wanted to become better, so he went to the local YMCA. He really didn't know much about prejudice at that time. He went into the Y, or tried to, and they barred him at the door. And he said, "Why?" And because of your skin color. And he said that's where he got to know what he called the monster prejudice. It's the first time he really faced that. It was very upsetting for him, as you can imagine. Yeah. He kept on competing. He had a mentor named Louis DeFranklin and Bertie Munger, who had a bicycle manufacturing company in Indianapolis. Munger realized what an incredible talent Major Taylor was, started training him, gave him a bike that was sort of a state-of-the-art bike, and saw that he was close to setting records as a very young racer.
Wow.
And Bertie Munger became so well known for training Major Taylor that Munger's business partners said, if you keep working with a black racer, we're going to keep you out of this business. And rather than fold, to his credit, and changing history, really, Bertie Munger said, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to Worcester, Massachusetts, which was more open to blacks. And he asked Major Taylor, would you come with me? I'll train you in Worcester, Massachusetts.
And about how old was he at that time?
I think he was around 15 or so, 14 or 15, around this time. And Bertie Munger made a pledge. He said, one day we'll return with you to Indianapolis and you'll be the fastest bicycle racer, the champion of the world. And incredibly, that's what would happen. It's such an incredible story that this would develop. But the bottom line is, because of racism, Taylor had to leave Indianapolis, leave his parents with their permission, promise his mother he would never race on Sunday for religious reasons, and went to Worcester, Massachusetts, where he, was basically helped by Bertie Munger and started racing more seriously in Worcester, where there was a huge cycling community.
So before we get into go to Worcester, how did he get his first bike, the one that he originally had in Indianapolis? Did his parents purchase that for him, or did the wealthy business owner purchase the bike for him? How did he get his first bike?
The sequence is he was borrowing a bike from the friend. He worked at a bike store. The bike store people would have allowed him to use one of their bikes. So he was pretty quickly in that cycling community and competing in a race that one of the bike stores put on and winning that race, much to his own surprise. The African-American press at the time started to take notice. So he got some stories written about him, and I think he was just 11 or 13. So very early on, he was becoming noticed. I mean, he was a prodigy, who just had this natural talent that a number of people came along. When he was working with Bertie Munger while still in Indianapolis, Munger had been himself a great champion, a national champion cyclist, mainly of the high-wheeled cycling days. And so the best cyclists of the country would come to visit Munger at his bicycle manufacturing company there. And one of them was a man named Arthur Zimmerman. Zimmerman wrote a book that I read. It's called Points on Training. And what this book did is it provided, in the early 1890s, a manual about how to be, a great athlete, how to eat, how to train, what his experiences were. And Major Taylor was able to read this and adopt a lot of those methods. So at a time when a lot of other cyclists, might have gotten lazy, did whatever they wanted, drank heavily, Major Taylor did not drink. He didn't use tobacco. He followed to a T the advice that Arthur Zimmerman wrote about in his book, Points on Training. And he said his ambition was to one day be the Black Zimmerman. So he had these incredible mentors. There are others as well we could talk about. But between Arthur Zimmerman, Bertie Munger, he was under the wing of some of the greatest cyclists of his time, men who did not have the same kind of prejudice that so many others did, and wanted to help him and did help him for years to come.
So I have a question for you before we go further. You said how he was able to read Zimmerman's books. And I do know just a little bit about that time, that was a time that literacy was at very low rates. And most African Americans were not literate reading and writing. How is it that Major Taylor was, because he was very literate, he even wrote his own autobiography. Do you know the backstory of where he how he became such a very literate and well-educated man compared to the typical population of the time?
Yeah, due to prejudice, he was denied the education that would have otherwise been available to him. It just seems like he was self-taught. He was a very smart young man, and was very well read, very well educated in his own way. So he read deeply. He actually wrote a letter in which he sort of made fun of people who said he couldn't be literate. So he wrote a letter, basically saying what he wanted to do, defending himself. So, this was a time also many whites, especially rural whites, were not literate either.
Right,
so,
right, correct.
You're right, in the Black community, it was a much lower percentage. This was one of the many things that he used. He was a deeply religious person. He was also a great musician. He played the piano. He was a poet. He said if he'd not been a champion cyclist, he thought maybe he'd be a poet. Yeah. So he's just incredible in many different respects.
He was a poet. We have one of his quotes on our trail that whenever I give tours of the trail, I say he was a poet and a rapper well before his time, because it rhymes. Because I think I had read somewhere that he was, when his best friend was getting in-home tutoring, that he was also learning from that in-home tutoring. I thought I saw something there. Did you ever run across anything like that?
This sounds like the Southern boy who was the white friend.
Yes.
I don't know if that was the one person that he would have been around an awful lot at a young age.
To have learned from. Okay.
So that might be what you're thinking of. That sounds right. Certainly he did many things. Okay. With this, he called himself the luckiest, person in the world, because he had this, I think that he referred to himself as being friends of a millionaire's son. I don't know if Southern's father was actually a millionaire, but
to him, he was a millionaire.
A lot of advantages. Yeah. He felt that he did have a lot of advantages that made this journey possible.
Yeah. All right. So now let's get into it. So now we're into his career, and I would like for you to take me to this time, and paint some pictures, and maybe even give some examples of some of the barriers and obstacles that Major Taylor overcame that makes his story just so incredible, and why his name really should be a household name like Jackie Robinson and Jesse Owens and Michael Jordan are. Can you take me back in time and really help our viewers understand his plight?
Right. So Brenda, like I mentioned, cycling was the most popular sport. How did they race? They were long races on roads, and Taylor did those, but became super popular. Velodromes were if you think of like an Indy 500 track, it's sort of the predecessor of that. They would have these cathedrals of cycling with these curved tracks that would just go around in an oval. And then they would have 10,000, 15,000 people in stands surrounding this oval. So what Taylor specialized in, were these sprints where he would go around and around in a race. He started with the road races for sure and did some of those throughout his career. But he didn't do a Tour de France type race. He was an expert in doing these shorter matches where you might be up against, let's just say, 10 other racers, people who were bigger than him. Major Taylor was 5'7" at his tallest. His typical good racing rate would have been about 143, although sometimes it got higher. So he wasn't a large person, which you would have wanted to be for sprinting. The typical great sprinters were bigger, bulkier, taller. So Taylor said to compete, he had to be in perfect athletic condition. If he was an ounce over or under his perfect weight, he said, he would lose his competitive edge. So that's why he ate so carefully. He trained incredibly. If you look at pictures of Major Taylor from the time he was 15, he looks pretty scrawny. And then you look at him a few years later, and he looks like one of the fittest people on the planet. It is remarkable what he did. In fact, in the back of my book, I was so impressed by his training regimen that I put basically, here's Taylor's training plan. It still is applicable today. How he raced, how he ate, what was his regimen, what kind of exercise did he do? He would do, go up against a boxing bag and do that. He would use all sorts of pulley systems for weight training. He did an awful lot that is applicable today that helped him get in that shape. Yeah. So he raced against the best racers of his day. Starting in Worcester, there were smaller races. Bertie Munger entered him in some other races. And so pretty quickly, before he was 18 years old, he was winning races already against some of the great riders. And in the day, so now it's 1896, there's still an era of millions of cycles, very few cars. The big race of the day was known as the 6-day race. And that occurs in the early iteration of Madison Square Garden, not today's, of course, but there was an earlier one that still could fit in whatever it was, 10,000 people, not well ventilated. And the idea of the 6-day race is what it sounds like. The cyclists would have to race 6 days around the track. Whoever had the most miles at the end of 6 days was the winner. It was a brutal, inhumane event that was later banned because it was so, bad for your health, to put it mildly. People would say that you never race the same again after doing this. So you take a rest for an hour or two, and then you try to catch up, and many people did not finish the race. So I can set the scene. You'd ask me, would I read something?
Yes, I did. Yes, I would love to hear you read your favorite excerpt. Yes, go right ahead.
Let me just bring out the glasses here, and I'll read
That's all right.
the opening paragraph of the book, which is the prologue, because I wanted to give you a sense. It's just going to be very short here, but this gives you a sense of what I try to do in the writing of this book and the scene I'm trying to set. So it's right off of page 1. And I think I should take a little sip of water before I start. So hang on 1 second.
That's fine.
All right. Prologue, Madison Square Garden, 1896. On the clear, brisk Saturday afternoon of December 5th, 1896, an unusual pair of men strode to New York City's Madison Square Garden, where thousands would soon assemble for one of the era's greatest sporting events. The first man, Louis de Franklin Munger, was a lissom figure with a hawkish gaze, a bristle-thick mustache, and close-cropped hair parted at the apex of his forehead. Munger had once been crowned the world's fastest man, and now at the age of 33, his championship days behind him, he was still recognized by an admiring public. Everyone called him Birdie, an appellation that evoked his love of speed and freedom. Now he had new ambitions. The second man, just 18 years old, was described by somewhat mysteriously in the press accounts as Munger's valet, or valet, depending on how you want to pronounce that. He seemed at first glance a short, slight figure, but a close look revealed a compact body with remarkable muscular legs. As the pair approached Madison and 26th Street, the arena, the second of what would be several iterations of Madison Square Garden, came into view. The structure was one of the city's greatest architectural confections, designed by the legendary Stanford White, whose firm was responsible for many of the Gilded Age mansions that line the most fashionable streets of Manhattan. So that starts sort of to put you in a scene in New York City in 1896, when this was the greatest arena in the country. This was where you went to see the greatest sporting event. Baseball's day would come, Boxing's day would soon come. But at this moment, at this time, the greatest cyclist in the world assembled at Madison Square Garden, and then in comes 18-year-old Major Taylor. Nobody knew who he was. There was a great cyclist named Eddie Cannonball, they called him, because he was so powerful. He was on the cover of magazines and newspapers. Major Taylor had barely been mentioned to the press at this point. The preliminary race, before they get to the 6-day race, is a sprint. And so right at the outset, Major Taylor is put up against the greatest sprinters in the world.
Wow.
And incredibly, Major Taylor beats Eddie Cannonball and all the other greatest sprinters. And so very quickly, people were saying, who is this Major Taylor? If you look at the New York City papers of that day, that night, that week, you will see story after story marveling at who is Major Taylor and his story. Yeah. At that point, there weren't photos of him. There were illustrations of him, but he's all over the many New York City newspapers.
Wow.
And then he competes in the 6-day race. He doesn't win, but he manages to finish. He had no business being in such an incredibly grueling race.
Right.
But he competed very well, did very well. And his renown around the world came from there. He had competed and won the sprint, competed and stayed in this race that many other went out of. So he was very quickly becoming a sensation around the world, attracting an awful lot of notice.
Yes. Okay, great. And we only have about 2.5 minutes left. I wanted you to talk about his personal life, but instead, can you talk about two stories or vignettes that I have shared over and over in less than 1 minute? One was that he changed racing because of the promise to his mother. Because originally racing was done on Sundays after church, and because he had promised his mom that he wouldn't race on Sundays, am I correct that many races ended up moving to Saturdays just so that they could get him on the marquee?
Well, particularly abroad. So in this country, there were efforts to ban him, but particularly when he raced in France, he initially said, even though he was given an offer of $10,000, I won't do it if I have to race on Sundays.
Okay.
Eventually, the promoter came back and said, okay, we agree. You don't have to race on Sundays. They wanted him so badly. Yeah. The other thing I would mention for Chicago is that he competed in Chicago in races that had a version of a motorcycle to pace behind that. He won those races. He was then invited to compete in the international championship. So he went to Montreal, Canada, won the world championship there. Unlike in this country where they played racist songs to, quote, celebrate his victory, when he was in Canada, they played the Star Spangled Banner. And he said as a result, he never felt more American than when they played the Star Spangled Banner for him in Canada.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a minute left. I wanted to talk about when there was a time, and I think I read this in his autobiography. The world's fastest man. Yes, there was a time when there was a race where they were on the train and they went to New York, and his team checked into whatever the hotel was, but they had him in a horse and buggy to go stay with an African-American family, and he told the buggy to no, take him back to the train, and that he was banned from racing for 2 years because he refused to pay the fine. But I don't know if we have time left to talk about that. But do you remember the incident that I'm referring to?
There are many incidents where he was banned. People didn't want him to race. They knew he was going to beat them, so they invoked Jim Crow. They say you can't race here. Taylor, if he wasn't allowed to race, he would often say, "I'm going to quit," but then he kept on racing. You know, what he did was he was a civil rights pioneer. One of the points of this story, and the reason I did it, is not just because he was this great cyclist. I wouldn't have written just about a cyclist, but that he, used his sport to elevate, his race. He wanted to show the racism was wrong, things that were said were wrong, that given a fair shake, anybody, should be able to compete and do their best. And that's all he was asking for.
And I often refer to him as I often refer to him when I give my talks as the Colin Kaepernick of his time. And the producers are telling us that we're out of time. I have exactly 60 seconds left. And so I need to set up for, thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for gracing me with your time and your talent. And I hope we can do this again later and talk even more about Major Taylor. And I hope our audience and viewers have learned more about him. And if you want to learn more about him, you can go and find Michael's book, or you can even look at Major Taylor's own autobiography. Next month, we will have our beloved alderman from the 21st Ward, Alderman Ronnie Mosley, and we will talk about what is the city doing to help bring our trail up to standards? Just find out what's happening in our ward. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to meeting and chatting with all of you again next month. Thank you.